I don't think I'll be able to see if I'm not over here. Yo, mosquito man.
What's that about?
I just hear you're like driving the charge. People are relying on Curtis Wells to fix our mosquito problem.
No. Chris is equally as guilty, if not more.
Hi, Mary.
He doesn't even live over there. He's like, what else? Right, you're like, I don't know what you're all complaining about.
He knows duty when he sees it.
It's my freaking back. Did you see the map?
It's gonna happen.
It's in my backyard.
The West Nile?
Yeah.
It's right on
It's-
Evan's house.
It is. It's like my back fence. Great.
We get West Nile every year though, right? People are just more hyper aware.
It's becoming more common. It's probably going to be the case that we'll get here every year.
Right.
It comes with the birds, so it doesn't really matter how much you treat for mosquitoes. But obviously, that's how it gets from
You still having a mosquito problem?
How do you know all this?
I've learned a
Where?
lot.
Yeah, I guess
Google it.
so.
I was Googling it yesterday.
Ours is gone.
I ain't got time for
We
Google.
never
It's
have
from
much.
Africa. Was it from Ghana or something? Originated?
I haven't done that much research.
Somewhere around the West Nile.
Somewhere around the West Nile.
Here goes the
Alright. Are we recording and
Share a
such?
microphone with Christina.
No way. Well, I might
Is
have
it-
pink eye. But I did just squirt breast milk in there. Not my own, someone else's. I went and got someone else's breast milk and put it in my eyeballs.
Why?
Because it's the best cure. It's better than the prescription breast milk,
Unbelievable.
I promise.
And you just,
I've read
so you're dealing with a potential case of pink eye and you're just right here.
You excited?
You can't.
As if
use-
West
I
Nile
disclosed
wasn't
it.
enough.
Go wash your hands.
This wasn't my idea of public service.
I think it's already fixed. The breast milk was like, bam, done.
Well, you got any more of it?
I do.
Yeah, maybe
I have
that'll
a secret store of
cure
liquid
Kurt's
gold
West
in my
Nile.
refrigerator right now.
Chris, that didn't work.
Are we recording? Are we getting all this over here?
Where's the sound?
They're getting their money's worth.
Is it going?
I
Should
sought
we do
out
it?
too, the
Yeah.
most potent, a mom with like a 1 week old. With the best of the best.
Wow.
Things you learn.
Oh, Mary, don't act like this is TMI.
You getting me eating, Doug? I hope you don't put those on.
He likes to get the worst of us.
I know. He published one where I was like hand flicking during a meeting. That's the picture that goes in the paper. All right.
Is the most recent version the one that was in the last packet?
Were some minor changes.
Did those get forwarded, or are we just going to go through them right now?
They're gonna be in the Tuesday packet.
Okay.
But
Are we
that's
ready?
what's up on the screen, right?
What would be in the Tuesday packet?
Okay. The time is now 1:07. I'd like to call to order this special meeting of the Grand County Council on Friday, July 12th, 2019. Those in attendance are Chris Baird, Barry McGann, Terry Morse, Zachariah Wine, Greg Halliday, Curtis Wells, Christina Salone, and Evan Clapper, and Ruth Dillon, and various members of the public. Did you want to start us off? Or
Maybe very briefly. Christina and I have been working very closely to finalize the ordinance language and code language and the maps for Tuesday. And in the process of going back and forth between the last public hearing, between the public hearing and today, we, I think both felt compelled to reach out to the council administrator and chair to call for a workshop today to ensure that on Tuesday, the council takes clear and decisive action, and that you are familiar with the ordinance and the code language and the specific sub-elements of it, and don't have a lot of questions or remaining items for debate on Tuesday. We want to try to get this thing as close as possible to what you would vote to approve on Tuesday. Now, this isn't the meeting where you would take action, so we acknowledge that. This is scheduled as a workshop, but I think it's perfectly acceptable to talk through, any remaining questions or potential changes to what you might take action on Tuesday. So, in your packet is essentially what's here on the screen. There have been some just grammatical and I think structural in terms of syntax changes, but in effect, it's the same as what you have in front of you. So there are a few specific sub-elements of the ordinance that I think we should talk through, but I'm happy to pass it over to Christina now, or any of you all, for that matter.
Yeah, I felt like in talking with Zachariah and talking with some certain council members, there are a couple things that I wanted to make sure you guys had pondered, put some time into, had sufficient discussion, which would result in changes from what you've had and what you've seen at the first public hearing. And so if we want to make those changes, we want to do them now before Tuesday. One of which is the expansion issue that I'll let Zachariah talk about, and one of which is amending the map to potentially include some certain properties property owners who have made takings claims against the county, which I've analyzed. I'm going to be requesting we go into closed session to discuss those before we discuss, the map amendment more generally. But those are my main two components I'd like to have some discussion on today.
Do you think it would be in our best interest to have that information that is needed in closed session up front, or should we wait?
It's unrelated to the expansion issue. We could talk about that first.
I think that's a simple one to talk through. I will also note that upon the county attorney's request, I have provided a substantial increase in the specificity of the whereas statements in the preamble of this ordinance. Those are important for the public. Those are important for the defensibility of the ordinance and to communicate the justifications for this ordinance. So I won't go through all of those today, but
I'll add that I think it's extremely impressive. I'm proud of us. Evan's going to get to read all those into the record. But also on Tuesday, I want y'all to spend time with this ordinance and those recitals before Tuesday, and I want your comments to relate in some way to those recitals, right? So more than just, hey, the public wants option 5. Try to make your comments relate to these recitals in some way.
So will we see the inserts prior to Tuesday?
If we can come up with them.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if we
Right.
can't, then
They'll just be
they'll
deleted.
Right.
Eliminated.
Yeah.
I read through them, and you did a great job.
Pretty persuasive, right?
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, it's just factual, and it is
Yeah.
very persuasive because you
Right.
got it all
Yeah.
of crux of the matter included in it. So, you did a great job.
One of the whereases that I wanted to discuss was the watershed whereas. So as it's written, it's nail on the head accurate. I guess the concern that I have is without any kind of mention of how much water we're currently using, it seems like context is lost. And we do have those numbers. So I wanted to raise that for discussion, which I think is, I think in general is a concern that I have with a lot of discussions that we're having. Is I got a lot of comments from citizens that are concerned because they're understanding that we're going to be mining the aquifer, if we continue to build out, or we may be right now. And the recharge figure that was reduced from 18 to 22,000 acre feet to 11 to 13,000 acre feet, is the numbers we have to work off. But the numbers we have to work off of use right now is still under 4,000 acre feet per year.
I think
we know
in reality, I think that a lot of the factual stuff and that is going to come out after next week's meetings on the VCAPS meetings and so on, because there are so many different conversations about what we're actually using in the discharge and how it's being used and all the rest of that. I think all that needs to be clarified pretty specifically so that we can figure out, for example, if you talk about water that's going down Mill Creek in the winter as discharge versus culinary water that's being used per capita every day by residents and visitors, and you lump the two together, you get a completely different figure than you would if you separated them out. So I think there's clarity that needs to be had in that conversation prior to relying on figures that may be batted around right now that I think will be much more clarified, in the next, some of it next week, and I think probably a lot of it thereafter.
So if the numbers we have to work off now, we know what the city's using on an annual basis, and that's over 3,000 acre feet.
Well, that's depletions versus diversions.
But
so it's important.
If this is that critical, I mean, wouldn't you want to, in this meeting that you're referring to, wouldn't you want to get that nailed down before you just fire off a whereas in an ordinance like this? It's a completely moving target because the consensus doesn't exist that, we're either mining the aquifer now or we're going to in the near future. I'm not. And if it does, it needs to be something other than there's a meeting next week that's going to settle all this. Trust me.
Well, the meeting next week won't settle it all. The whole point is that we need to address the water situation, and it may take months to get it all addressed. And at the end of the day, we think we know that through the USGS study that there is maybe 11 to 13,000 acre feet of recharge. But probably a better whereas statement would be whereas the community is concerned about its water resources and needs to further investigate the actual recharge and discharge in the Valley Aquifer and the Glen Canyon Aquifer prior to any increased additional stress on the system. You follow me?
I think that's my. That's the point that I'm making is I think we're presenting one half of the equation, and it's factual and it's firm, but what it's doing to a lot of people is it's leaving them open-ended to assume that we're out of water or we're out of water really fast.
Yeah. I think it's fair just to state that this is a huge concern and this is one that needs to be addressed, and we realize it needs to be addressed, and therefore we are taking this action so we have time actually to address it in a manner in which it needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and then also, something along the lines of our interest in promoting, water conservation, like in terms of development and stuff, because that, to me, we're at a point now where, regardless of the scientific community dialing these numbers, we should all be on board of water conservation. And when we're, evaluating an ordinance that is going to affect development, I guess to me that's a more appropriate statement than here's one half of the issue with the water availability, I guess. But rounding that out to be more general, I would definitely agree with that. And I'm not the water expert in the room, but I know enough to have the conversation, and I see a lot of unintended consequences with the way we're framing the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I would go along with what you're saying, but I do think it's important to have a general mention of that in the whereas statement.
So whereas.
Zachariah, did you have something to?
Yeah, I guess a couple thoughts. First, I agree this is more a statement of fact, and it would be potentially more effective if the statement of fact was translated into a statement about how that fact contributes to the need for this ordinance. I would also say that given the uncertainty around some of these figures, as well as the perspective on water rights allocations in the state of Utah, and some very clear statements from the Division of Water Rights on how this community could continue to grow even if the Glen Canyon Aquifer is tapped or is being mined. It's not wise, and that's one reason why our office at least has not been pushing this issue really strongly as a primary justification for the ordinance, is that if that were the only justification, I don't think it would be one that we would want to hang our hats on in the state of Utah. The state of Utah is not going to allow changes to use rights or limitations on growth or growth management policies strictly on the basis of the Glen Canyon Aquifer being mined. So that said,
Although, didn't they just amend the temporary land use statute to allow water
for water studies
specifically
Yeah.
as a legitimate reason for a moratorium?
Yeah, for an extended moratorium. So I think, I guess what I'm getting at is that as one whereas statement within this larger body of whereas statements, I think some minor amendments would be adequate. And so I would recommend that maybe Curtis and Terry submit some requested changes. You and I can finalize them, or, obviously it's up to you guys at the end of the day, but if you want to.
What you said sounded good.
Yeah, it did sound good, didn't it?
I can work on it too. I haven't seen that Jeff Adams overview summary thing, so if you would
Okay.
send that to me.
Sure.
I think the way I would approach it is, here are the stats we have, and here's what we don't know, and we need to study it more, and
Yeah.
we're worried about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Any
I
other?
would be also, but I would be also a little bit careful about saying that we're throwing out this 11 to 13 number from a report that hasn't been finalized and publicly dispersed. So
It does say draft.
it is obviously a draft.
We can only rely on what we have.
And they haven't indicated any change to that, is my understanding.
No, I haven't heard.
That's true.
I haven't heard either, but until you have the final.
But
You could call it from the draft. Yeah, that's fine.
Can I ask a question here? Do we have any monitoring wells around here?
There are a couple of them, and
What has been the trend over the last 10 years?
It's going down.
if you look at
Going down.
the Mike Duncan did a study on the city wells, and over the last 15 years, I think, and don't quote me on this because I haven't actually seen and read it, but I think he mentioned that there had been a 5% decrease over the last 8 years, I think, something like that.
like in a gallons per minute or in volume?
In volume.
Well, somebody's not using, property changes hand and somebody's not using the well as much, that's going to change.
Yeah, well, I don't know. It might have been gallons.
So this
Well,
is
it
my
depends-
point, is we get into
depends
these
on how many
policy
wells there
discussions
are
and
where.
Well, my point is that, look, it needs to be mentioned, And Howie mentioned that, doesn't really matter so much as the fact that the public knows that it's a concern and that we are investigating it and trying to get it figured out.
So we can make
I think that's fair.
better
And-
policy.
And Zachariah, to my understanding, is absolutely correct with regard to the state of Utah. And people can develop, but if there's no water, you have to haul it like Cedar City's doing. And the question is, that we have to ask is do we want a community that has to haul water in order to exist? And
Well, to get there, we have to know what our use is.
No,
And
understood,
the figure
understood.
of dropping from 18,000 to 22,000 acre feet to 11 to 13,000 acre feet doesn't really say much if you don't know what your use is on an annual basis. And that's my point is it leads to speculation because it is a pretty significant drop. I mean, we can agree on that.
So we can work on a more general whereas for
Yeah.
for water conservation. And great. Are there other whereases that we should focus on right now? All right, should we jump into the expansion?
Let's do it.
Okay, so I think the reason Christina wanted to talk about this is that perhaps there hasn't been sufficient discourse on it in prior council meetings, and that is the recommendation from the Planning Commission that existing overnight development accommodations would be prohibited from expanding. So these would be existing or vested projects, meaning, once this ordinance is adopted, what's on the ground would be what they're entitled to. We know of at least a couple campgrounds that have indicated they have, some land within their parcel that would be fully covered by the overlay that has not yet been developed, and they haven't submitted any plans, but, thought that they would expand in the future. For me, that's, those individual instances aren't what is driving this conversation, but just generally the conversation about, your feeling towards expansion of existing invested projects. And this could also apply to redevelopment, right? And the position that I communicated to the Planning Commission when talking about this first was that, even if we're not ready to allow expansion in the short term, in particular because we maybe don't have the standards, whether they're mixed use or design or performance or operational, or because, there's just, concern about additional accommodations. If new accommodations approvals are going to be part of the mix, it probably makes the most sense to allow those on the properties that have already been developed for overnight accommodations for two reasons. That limits the conversion of land from non-overnight accommodations or just raw land to accommodations, and it, supports this notion that you want to preserve land for other necessary and beneficial uses. But it also just concentrates the accommodations activity where it already exists and where the public is generally already aware and, I don't know if accepting is the right word, but certainly aware that accommodations are already there. I think it's probably less of a short-term issue for many hotels and motels, which already largely take up their entire footprint on their parcels, than it is for some of these like campgrounds that haven't fully developed on their parcels, and some of them, especially on the periphery of the county, are quite large, right? Like Archview or Moab Under Canvas, they have a lot of acreage that they haven't developed, so you could see some very significant expansions. But I think, so here's another, I think, consideration that is relevant. What we communicated to the Planning Commission as far as redevelopment is concerned is that, if an existing accommodations development wanted to redevelop, they would be allowed to rebuild or remodel or redesign up to the same number of overnight accommodations units as they currently have. And then, of course, otherwise permitted uses in the underlying zone district would be, reviewed and approved as they would, for any property. So, for instance, you take a 20-unit hotel. It's older, it needs to be redeveloped, brought up to, modern standards. They could redevelop those 20 units and then, add a restaurant or office space or residential units, as long as the underlying zone district allowed for them and they had space, and, this overlay wouldn't have any bearing on that. Another perspective that I think we want to talk about today is, and I don't know that you have to take action on this Tuesday, but it's something to consider, is that in light of what I said initially regarding like the sort of, planning principles or guidelines for where new approvals make sense, something you could be thinking about is, is there a threshold of expansion that is of little concern, say 5 or 10% or whatever it might be, where you would be okay with that, and then beyond that threshold, new standards that it will be developed for all accommodations developments, whether they're expansions or redevelopments or new approvals, would apply. The Assured Housing Ordinance would apply. Mixed use requirements or energy efficiency and water efficiency standards would apply. Our office didn't get that much traction with the Planning Commission when broaching this subject, but I don't know that. I think Christina urged me to bring it up today because, there have been some public comments about it from campground representatives, and, not clear that you have discussed it adequately in your meetings. Do you want to
I'll
add?
just add quickly on that point, and I admit I don't read every public comment, but 100% of the public comments I've seen about expansion specifically support it. I haven't seen any that oppose it, specifically expansion. And so I'm wondering why the PC, it's my understanding that the ordinance proposal that went to the Planning Commission did not include this prohibition against expansion. So I'm wondering what what was their reasoning?
Right. I don't know that I can corroborate, your statement about public comments for or against, right? I can't recall, and we don't have any stats on that issue specifically, but when discussing it with the Planning Commission, I think that there are a multitude of issues, right, that they're trying to address with this ordinance, and one of them is just generally the question about growth, right, and growth in lodging and visitation. And so another issue is concern about land conversion, right, and land being gobbled up by accommodations and not being available for other uses, and water and traffic. But with respect to the expansion question, I think that the primary logic was, the community and many of the public comments have been about growth in visitation, generally speaking, and by accommodating expansion, we're not responding to that, frankly, pretty prominent public concern. Now, there have been other, public comments that are contradictory to that, right, or opposed to that. So that's just the Planning Commission logic that I recall.
There was some of the bed and breakfast comments that kind of come in later that we've heard from since we started having the discussion about whether to separate bed and breakfast from the nightly rentals overlay and create their own overlay. I know at least 2 of the citizens that reached out, their situation was that they have an existing bed and breakfast, and when we removed bed and breakfast, when we created a legal non-conforming use situation for them, it took away their ability to expand. And so I would assume, I don't know that this is the driving reason for that language, but
I don't think that it has much to do with the bed and breakfasts.
okay.
Yeah.
So,
I think with the standards that we're yet to see and kind of any sort of new development or things, I would really like to see those standards be at a level that, citizens would be okay with, and in a way that would kind of mitigate a lot of these impacts, like even with transportation requirements so that we're not adding traffic to 191 and things like that, or, they got to provide bikes for people to use downtown or whatever it is. And so I think with that in mind, I would really like to see any kind of new development be something that people were excited about, and that they were saying, yes, this is what we want. And with that in mind, that any kind of redevelopment, expansion sort of stuff would just be held to that standard. And I think that there is some legitimacy to the campgrounds, that haven't fully developed on their property. One of the things that I also would be worried about is purchasing neighboring properties for expansion. So I wouldn't necessarily want to open that door, because I don't want to, I want to kind of keep that available for diversification and other commercial ventures. I think that if it would be possible to build a 25-unit place that would have less impact or a more desirable impact than a current 20-unit one. And so I wouldn't want to shut that option down. As long as they're redeveloping or expanding to the standards that are yet to be determined, I would be okay with some expansion on current property.
There's experience of that, a history of that in some other resorts whose names I won't mention, where they they allowed some expansion, but they tied it in with just that, and were able to, because the property was so old, when it was expanded, the square footage that was added, which was, not that much, the value of it paid for the full restoration of the rest of the building. So I think that looking 20 years down the road, it would be crazy not to include some provision for expansion, because if that happens, then you can take, if there's an architecturally unsuitable structure at the time, and you want to
Right.
revamp, or the owner wants to revamp it, you can also then compel them to redo the architecture of the building itself to conform with whatever fits in the community a lot better at the time. So I agree with allowing some form of it, and I think that at some point, and I don't know how we do this right now, but at some point, you could put limits on percentage of square foot of expansion, and that sort of thing, if that became a problem or a concern with how much expansion. Because ultimately what'll happen is the expansion will end up going upward rather than sideways.
Yeah.
So,
I wonder if there's just adding on to the highlighted part on the screen here, without conforming to newly adopted standards or whatever.
I think we'd rewrite that.
yeah, we would just, I think when we get those, we would just probably remove this
Yeah.
statement, and we'd probably add context to it, because there may be some standards that are pertinent to redevelopment or expansion that are not pertinent to new development, right? So we want to make sure we work through those in the follow-up process. I would add to Terry's comment about the likelihood that allowances for expansion or redevelopment are likely to make some of those redevelopments more feasible, financially feasible, which would be in the interest of the community in some properties, right? In the same way that as we start to talk about new approvals and these mixed-use performance, design standards that are to be developed, the reality is that some of the other uses that this community is looking for, right, that we've talked about with respect to economic diversification, only become viable or become more viable when they are allowed to have, some number of overnight accommodations. So the example I keep throwing out is, if we want more restaurants in this community, one way to ensure the economic viability of those restaurants is to allow, a handful of overnight accommodations units in the same vicinity as those, right, to essentially guarantee a customer base, right? Now, again, that's after this ordinance, and those standards are yet to be developed. But I think one, and again, our office did not advocate for this prohibition on expansion. But I think one benefit of waiting, and even if we didn't wait, one benefit of including expansion in this ordinance is to ensure that, if expansion or redevelopment happens, that the developer is required to submit a master plan that gets recorded and guides the development. And that's one of the, significant improvements that comes with this draft ordinance above and beyond our existing regulations, is the submission of a master plan and development agreement. So
similarly,
Well, just to your point of overnight accommodations allowing for less competitive businesses to develop, doesn't that still hold some place that if you wanted to build a business park or something and you weren't interested in running overnight accommodations, that then you would have to compete with that value? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's why we still have to work through that conversation. I'm just suggesting that, that's one piece of logic that I think fits into the conversation about what standards get applied to new approvals down the road.
I think one of our big whereases is, to encourage diversification.
Sure.
So I think as long as that accommodation still has a toehold in all the areas,
right,
then we're not really making big strides towards that. So
fair enough. Yeah.
So I agree that with expansions, I think that's mostly going to affect campgrounds versus redevelopment, which is going to affect all the OAs. And with campgrounds, can't we handle that through a CUP process anyway, per current code? Like we could write that expansion use subject to CUP, and then we could require, similar stuff, and that could be a good way to manage that expansion.
Yeah.
So from here, should we just propose some expansion language to council prior to Tuesday? What's our next step?
I don't feel prepared to propose expansion language prior to Tuesday, and it hasn't, if it's going to go into the campground standards, I think that needs to start back at the Planning Commission with the standard public hearing process.
This sentence out of the ordinance.
I think this sentence stays until those standards are developed, those expansion standards.
Yeah, because you've got to hold that until you do change it.
Right.
Otherwise, you'll assume that expansion's okay.
Right. And we'll start getting expansion applications.
Okay.
Could I ask that for the public's benefit and the viewing benefit, you could maybe read the statement that you're saying should stay in?
Sure. And I can zoom in a little bit as well. So the statement is, existing overnight accommodations developments shall not be allowed to expand the number of spaces, lots, or units for which they were originally approved to use as overnight accommodations. So again, it still allows for new approvals of other uses that are allowed by the underlying zone district, be it, office, restaurant, other commercial activities, residential activities, but not more accommodations units.
So how are we going to deal with that in the future if they need 5% increase in accommodation units to pay for all the rest of it?
Yeah, we'll have to work on those standards.
I guess what I'm asking is there any way, or does it make sense for us to, how do we let everybody know that that's something that we're working on with the consideration and or supposition that will be put in place at some time in the very near future?
I think in the same way that you let the community know that we will continue working on, mixed use and design and performance standards for new accommodations, developments, writ large, right? So whether you want to do that in this discussion or after you take action, I don't know if that matters. If you want to ensure that the paper reports that, if you want to write a letter to I don't know that.
Do you have a goal for when we'd have those standards available or in place?
My hope is that the Planning Commission, so I've hesitated to really launch into that conversation with the Planning Commission until the cards fall where they fall with your action on Tuesday. I know that Nora Shepherd is kind of in the same position over at the city, and what we would like to do is, hopefully pivot as quickly as possible, and hopefully there's not too much planning exhaustion in our community to continue digging into these, and that is a real concern, right? I mean, the planning exhaustion is a real phenomena. But that we could again, embark on a coordinated effort to dig into some of these questions. And frankly, it's not my forte. I mean, the operational and performance standards are, the mixed use stuff is, but I'm not a form-based planner, if you will. I'm not a designer. So we may need some help on that. But to answer your question, my hope is that we can have a recommendation to you, within the next 6 months.
We need to do it within 6 months. That's what I would say.
So we can, that's where I was going with it, was on Tuesday we could put a deadline for standards deliverables.
I don't love the idea of a deadline, but
A guideline, we'd like to see this done by.
Well,
So the city.
unfunded mandates as well are quite difficult for administrative staff.
Like a deadline for October, but
The Planning Commission recommended it, yeah.
This damn planning commission. What I'm wondering is do we have a sense of how they're tracking as far as, are they gonna outsource that to like Landmark or like some of these standards you're referring to, or what's their?
Nora and I have started talking about that, and we've got some ideas, but I think both of us are likely to want to have some assistance with both the standards and the engagement component.
I was also hoping that we were going to get more in that realm from Landmark out of this wave. So
We have some very general standards, but they need to be reworked.
can we put the squeeze on them while we still got them on the hook to?
We, I don't know how much money is left in that budget, or if we want to use Landmark.
That's kind of where I was at.
Well, I'll be comfortable with it as long as we know that it's not dropping through the cracks, and that's the next item on the agenda. Because I think it's critical that that gets put in place.
Yeah, for me, expansion and redevelopment standards are
It's huge.
even more important than new approvals in the context of those planning principles that I
I agree.
communicated earlier.
Could we put that in somewhat that, like you were talking about a timeline, that in the timeline we had expansion developing criteria for expansion, then developing criteria for, so that it's still saying that that's a big priority.
Yeah, I think we
That
need
would
to
be a
have
timeline.
discussion on Tuesday very specifically about it. And I also think we should reach out, and I can do that specifically to a few of these campground owners who are specifically affected. Because really, they have a 30-day appeal deadline. They're going to have to decide whether they go ahead and appeal this ordinance on its face because this language is in there, or whether they're going to take our good faith effort to, in promising them that we're going to work on the expansion.
That's going to
language.
be, if we could somehow say that that's our, set up like a time, like I liked your idea of a timeline, like we're going to work on this, then we're going to work on, and so that the public has a sense of where we're going and, a roadmap that we'll be working on them somewhat simultaneously, but still putting the emphasis on.
Like an order of operations.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I will be frank, I'm a little hesitant to recommend, dates.
No, I didn't mean.
Certainly without any secured funding, because planning processes take a long time and public engagement takes a long time, and I am concerned about planning exhaustion in this community, not just on this issue, but on, a lot of planning questions. But I certainly, would recommend and support, definitive statement of intent, to continue working on these issues.
So, would you be open to considering, like, a time, 6 months to a year, or a year to 18 months, or something like that, so that at the end of the day, we say, well, within the next year, we want to have this done. I guess what I'm saying is that I feel more comfortable if I know there's a date certain by which, and yet I understand exactly what you're saying, and the question I'm asking is, when you go back to your office and start thinking about it, and so on and so forth, I guess it would be great if you could come up with a date certain, or a date within, a block of time that we might be able to accomplish this by, and without putting undue stress on the system.
I can give you a date with some contingencies.
Yeah, we're not talking about a legally binding date.
No, seriously, because I think.
Yeah.
Sure, just a guideline.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not like
Yeah.
a moratorium date that we had.
You're not going to get fired if you don't get the standards done in 6 months.
Well, it's less a
Hey, that's
concern
fine,
about,
though.
it's less a concern about me and more a concern about, legal challenges down the road if certain dates are not met.
Well, I liked the term you said, order of
Operations.
so that we're going to get this done, we're going to do it in as timely a fashion as will enable us to do it correctly. I didn't, but somehow the language that we're going to do it as quickly as we can without jeopardizing quality.
And there are a lot of, other communities. We're not inventing the wheel here. There's a lot of resource to reach out to. I'm sure a consultant is a really good idea as well, but 6 months seems doable to me, but Zachariah's office does the bulk of the work.
6 months went by so fast.
Well, yeah, and I think that the most important thing is letting the public know that we're doing it. And just because we are talking about expansion doesn't mean that we're going to approve expansion. What it means is that we're putting in place the elements that will benefit the community and the overall whatever quality of life, if you will, in the community.
Expansion
if it happens.
If it happens, yeah.
So.
Will enhance
Okay.
the.
I'm comfortable with that.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other,
So one of the things with, just kind of like, being ready for a vote on Tuesday is, so right out of the gate, we're setting the overlay on existing ones. What if people that aren't included in the overlay, in the future want to apply to have it applied to their property.
That is set forth in the
Which one?
Yeah,
In the
it lays
ordinance.
that out. Application.
So it's actually quite similar to the design of the high-density housing overlay. So there's a pre-application. Our office will go through the legislative intent and the process and the standards with a potential applicant. And then there's a procedure. It's very similar to a rezone, but in conjunction with a standard rezone application, an applicant would be required to submit a development agreement and a master plan. And, we have some preliminary standards in there. And so, I think, the more specific standards that we're talking about, these mixed-use performance operational standards, my presumption is that you're going to want those in place before you say yes to a request. Certainly, individual owners, developers could come to you prior to those standards being in place, but that's at their own discretion and their own risk.
But with the high density housing overlay, we created a map, and we were basically like, if you're not on the map, don't even bother asking.
Right.
But we don't have a map like that for this.
Correct.
So could
So any property could come to you.
residential or anything, and so they would ask for a commercial rezone and then to have the overlay.
They would
or-
just ask for the overlay.
okay.
But they have to,
Jump through all the hoops.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
they have to put all the site plan.
And I think the expectation is that, the response is likely to be no.
Well,
Uh,
prior to any standards, you would be really foolish to move forward with all that investment
Right.
and preparing your development without it.
Yeah. No,
Not
it
to
was
say
just-
it won't happen.
It was
Right.
more the mapping exercise that I.
Yeah,
wanted
so
to do.
so
We need this in
the
place.
distinction, and I did receive a few questions about this, the distinction between the map that was produced for the high-density housing overlay and this is that we went through an extensive process of evaluating which properties were appropriate / eligible to receive the overlay or to attach it to their parcel. We started to go down that pathway when Landmark presented these very rough boundaries. Do you remember the terms like South Moab, OAO? I think, we sort of abandoned
Right.
those boundaries because there wasn't adequate effort that went into determining which parcels were actually appropriate for development, and knowing that the process was already established, which is why this is not an outright ban on overnight accommodations. It reestablishes, or it redesigns the process for approval. So that's a really important, aspect of this, and one that I think, you should be confident in communicating to the public and to the Utah legislature, frankly, is that this is not an outright ban. It requires a legislative review and approval rather than it being a use by right, an automatic, ability to develop overnight accommodations. But, our office has been hesitant to present these larger polygons of which parcels would be eligible to seek this overlay because we just haven't done that work yet. And so, 6 months down the road after we've established these standards, you may not even feel the need to establish those larger polygons, or you may feel the need to establish those polygons, or some standards may apply to some polygons and other standards would apply to different polygons. For instance, like you could have a set of mixed use requirements for properties in the south corridor, but those wouldn't apply to properties in Thompson or Elgin. Just for, an example. So that again, there's just a lot of work that's remains to be done on that.
One of the unintended consequences of that is happening right now with the high density housing overlay is, and you can't get these things right, out of the gate. You put these kinds of things out there and the market kind of deals with them. But we've got a map for the high density housing overlay, and there's been quite a bit of interest, and a lot of property on the market right now in Moab. The listings themselves are including descriptions of what density could be available with the high density housing overlay. But what happens is there's an assumption that it's just standards you have to meet and it's automatic, and the idea of legislative approval is not really sinking into buyers and sellers. And so I think I added a discussion item on the agenda next week, because it's one of those things that's tricky, especially now that we've hit the sunset clause limit, is if we're starting to, I've heard our board in the past couple of weeks start to kind of take some steps back and say, well, we need to discuss this limit and what we may do there, and the market's just not really privy to that. So you'll have situations where people are buying property because they're being told that it's eligible for this what they're equating to basically an up zone, with these standards. And then they're going to come in and say, well, what's the deal? You guys just put this out there 3-4 months ago, and now you're telling me the board can tell me no?
Tell you what, that's on the realtors for not
and we're
disclosing.
It's a communication disconnect.
You know what? They've got an obligation to know what the legal ramifications are of any zoning in the area in which they're selling, and if they don't, and they misrepresent it, that's on them.
Terry, I'm not disagreeing with that. Yeah. I'm just saying it's a fact that stuff happens.
Well, I
think more importantly, what I'm saying is that it is unique in that it's only been out there for a few months. And I think the responsibility on us, if you will, is if we're at a point where we're asking for this kind of development and we change our minds, we need to let them know. And I think that's what's on deck now with this high density housing ordinance is if we're going to stop approving projects, whether for that sunset clause or whatever reason, we need to let the market know. And we haven't done that. We're getting a little bit off base. The point that I'm making is I think what you're saying is, we're going to provide some zones where additional development could be eligible. It creates sometimes some gray area. And I think this idea, when you talk to the city as they've gone through this process, I've talked to the city council members and the mayor, and one of their reasons that they've communicated to me that they didn't like these overlays is they don't like the legislative approval, because it kind of can get sticky that way when it's the board doesn't like this project for this reason, and so they can deny it, when it's just a standard black and white, here's what you have to do to qualify. If you meet those regulations or those that compliance, then you get to move forward. It's a much more cut and dry situation. And I think we are going to have some sticky conversations with the high density housing overlay, but I can imagine getting into those conversations on something like this, where someone's saying, you guys threw this map out there and said, I could apply for this, so I went and spent all this money, and at the end of the day, you might have a realtor or two that miscommunicated that, but it still doesn't mean we have to be ignorant of that.
Yeah, so I actually think that's a great point, and it is one of the justifications for abandoning that approach of establishing these larger polygons, which would dictate eligibility, and that is the issue of expectation, right? And that's the point that Curtis was touching on there, is that by drawing these larger polygons and saying parcels in here are eligible to come seek the overnight accommodations overlay, right off the bat you're establishing an expectation that at least it's possible. It's not guaranteed, but it's possible. Yeah. And so this approach, which is just attaching the overlay to existing invested projects and individual parcels, I think eliminates that expectation.
Good.
It's still possible, but it,
Sure.
it eliminates the expectation.
And then what about to the point of, having the standards still be a legislative decision versus the route that the city's going, where they're...
Well, at this stage, the city is not, committing to administrative approvals or integrating. I think they're still working through, having some base zone districts where there are administrative approvals of new overnight accommodations if certain standards are met. But by and large, I think that they are still following this approach. And the reason why, for accommodations in particular, as opposed to like other, land uses in the community, just given the sensitivity around them and the impact on, growth here, I do think that one of the chief desires of the residents who have participated in this planning process have been, even if we are supportive of growth, we need this legislative step in here in order to have more control over the rate and volume of growth. And that's what you get with the legislative review and approval. If it's administrative, you lose a lot of control over.
They have to just meet the standards in an administrative, but with the legislative, we have more.
You have more discretion over time.
Discretion.
So I agree with what Curtis says about the polygons creating expectations, and that's one of the biggest reasons that I pushed for having a sunset clause and limits on that put in there so that we could review it. And now we're at that point, and we may have to go back and review it
Sooner than we thought.
sooner than we
Right away.
Certainly, yeah. But my point is that well, first of all, it's not really apropos to the discussion we're having, and second of all, it's something we will have to deal with, but not in this conversation, probably.
Not today, at least, but I would say that it's appropriate in the sense that, once standards are established and you all feel comfortable, and I'm not presuming you will, but if you do feel comfortable reintegrating, or I guess, approving requests to overnight accommodations overlays, is that, it's not off the table to also include a unit-based sunset clause or a, square footage-based sunset clause or something like that.
I think the legislative approval part, especially when you're talking about overnight accommodations, is, ask yourself the question, if you were an investor right now and you wanted to build an overnight accommodations development and it was up to this board and the way this board is running now, would you do it? Invest all that money in a site plan and a business plan and then put it forth to this board? I'm just saying, for the sake of thought, I wouldn't. But when it comes to housing, it's a little bit of a different deal. But
right.
that space where we review it and we have all these things we're weighing and we have this flexibility, it's just not something that, for whatever reason, the market's really got their finger on the pulse at that. They look at the standards and I don't have all the frames of reference for how every city and county operates, and I think their inkling is to say, well, if we meet these standards, then why would they not?
Yeah, developers want as much certainty as possible.
It's risk. It's
But I think that's endemic in the stage of the development as a resort community that
Yes.
we're in right now. And it's a learning curve that's got to be almost vertical because it's happened so fast. And we all need to learn it, from the realtors to the buyers to the sellers to the people that live here and blah, blah, blah.
Well, if we don't, if we're regulating lodging development and the sentiment is we need to cool on that and grow other things, then if you're going to move forward and you really want to develop in Moab, otherwise you're going to go somewhere else because the policies are saying,
No, if you really want to develop.
you got to jump through all these hoops and then you have to get the board approval.
If you want to develop overnight accommodations. But,
Right. That's what I mean.
I could develop a manufacturing center that could be highly successful and increase the land value, tremendously, know, if
You
I had the
could?
right idea, sure, of course.
If you have the
Let's
right-
talk.
Yeah. No, seriously, I mean, you know, the reason people are successful in the entrepreneurial world is because they're imaginative and they come up with new ideas and they're creative. And that creates value. It creates value in their product, it creates value in the land that the product's sitting on. And, you know, it's very easy to take a cookie cutter idea and just stamp it out because, you know, because you
I
can do
disagree
it.
with that. There's
Well-
demand for it. That's why people are doing it.
So let's get back to the ordinance, because I think this is all relevant, but
Yeah,
it's also what we want to try to avoid on Tuesday, I think.
wants to do this today.
Maybe I better show up at the meeting.
No.
Not to cut off the conversation
but
too
I-
prematurely, but just to also, again, like, you know, remind what our goal is.
To get out of here in 20 minutes, go into closed session. So are there any other?
Well, I mean, I think to that point, I guess I'm a little curious of just kind of like how people are saying, you know, if we are still having heated discussions when we are, you know, close to a final draft here, you know, is this way off the mark? Is it, you know, is it, because I can also see like the flip side of the legislative approval, you know, is that the current council might have it kind of shut down, but there might be a future council one day that just like opens the floodgates.
Or a
And,
commission.
yeah, and so it's like, you know, like I don't want this to be something that's, you know, coming up with every election cycle, that it's like, okay, now we're cleaning the slate, now we're piling it back on, now we're cleaning the slate and piling it back on. And so I think it is worth getting it right, and I know that this was kind of an early tool that we adopted with the legislative process, but
I feel comfortable with it if we have some type of, you know, order of operation that we can give to the public to know that this is, you know, this is where it is now, why we fine tune it, that this is not the end product, but this is you know, this is the base that we're starting on, and hope, you know, and within a year, we hope to, our plan, let's not use the word hope, that seems so hopeless, but it's our plan to have something in place to enable people to.
So here's my perspective on that. I know it's contrary to the way that most people look at zoning, but zoning as an institution has never been set in stone. It has always been intended to be, you know, living document. It's intended to evolve to reflect changing conditions on the ground and to facilitate, you know, community development goals. And so in light of that, I mean, my perspective, and again, I've said multiple times, this is not where I thought we were going to end up after this 6-month process. And so, that said, you know, I feel confident that this document accurately reflects the vast majority of the perception in our community about, you know, what's going on now and what should go on, at least in the near-term future. And so at this time, not necessarily 5 years from now, maybe even not 10 years prior to now, right? But at this time, you know, I feel confident, or I guess you know, I'm very accepting of this approach from a planning perspective and an economic development perspective, largely because of what I think Terry hit on the nail, which is that, you know, where we are in the evolution of our community as a destination community, I think really fosters this type of legislative action. And in some ways it's precedent setting, and in some ways, you know, I think there are going to be many communities that look at an action like this and say, wow, you know, that's really bold. But boy, is it the right thing to do.
yeah, and I think that, you know, to Kurt's point of you know, developers wanting a certain degree of certainty, you know, I could also see very similar language that's also a big, bold move that, kind of outline things to a standard that we would all be excited for, that we'd be begging, like, yes, you've got that, come build that here. That's exactly what we want. Like, I think we could outline those standards and not necessarily, and remove some of that uncertainty that he's talking about, where it's like, if you can do X, Y, and Z and deliver that to this community, like, green light.
Absolutely.
Yeah. To add to that, I think the hardest, because long-term, high-level perspective, I totally get what, this isn't a grab on people's private property rights. This is a town that's doing some catch-up and some planning at a time when it is difficult, because the balance that we're trying to create is it's thick and heavy right now. And so it creates some friction, and what that does to the individual who hasn't yet realized that highest and best use is not pretty. And most of those situations, a lot of those situations, it's not the greedy out of town developer. It's a local, or it's someone that's invested their savings into a little development in Moab. And so it's to me, it's really hard to see those people clipped, and it is a trade-off to some extent. And I think that that's been the hardest part for me, was when we enacted the moratorium, raising the bar and requirements and standards and water conservation and all those things. I'm all for. I think to a certain level, it's fair to raise. And it's like the dark skies thing. I've taken a ton of crap over that, but in context, it's okay for the town to do some planning to preserve, quality and to sophisticate things, and so I'm fine with that. And those
I heard you're a progressive now.
Well, you heard wrong, sister. But so those elements of this, I'm all for, and I think as long as there's a pathway for people to pursue, that highest and best use, albeit with a raised bar, I think that's just in some ways the reality that they've waited for a long time, or it's just the circumstance. But I think but I think ultimately, I guess, what we need to factor in is, what are our intentions? And there are a lot of people that are a no net gain in one more lodging unit. I mean, they feel that way. And there are people that are in the camp of, we're okay with more lodging as long as it accounts for these things and it's up to this standard and it's cosmetically beautiful and all these things. And so I think it's important, that we establish it, at least right now where we're at, in this, because if we are going to consider, more lodging development, but with a raised bar, I do think it's necessary to provide some kind of timeline and some kind of clear position to the public and the property owners is, this is the direction that we are going. I think just where I see those things getting in trouble is just the variability of the board, but I don't know if you can avoid that.
Well, I think, I think that what we have to hope is that the people that follow will be able to understand and continue the vision. And that's all you can hope for. I mean, you do the best you can while you're doing it, and that's what we're doing here. If we can do this and develop the standards that go with it, again, you can't totally shut down growth, because that's what we do as human beings. We grow, but when we die, we got to remake ourselves. The community does, and that's basically what we're doing. We're adding new parameters for making our community a better place to be, and it's going to take a while, and we just have to do it. But,
so like the golden question, and this is a question for all the council members, is if it were up to you, Terry, are you okay with with additional growth and overnight accommodations, as long as it abides by these standards that are yet to be developed. I mean, is that your intention as a policymaker? Is your intention to,
I think it's inevitable because it's human, you know.
not if you remove lodging as a permitted use and then you just say that's it?
But that's not what we're doing.
Well, that's,
In the short term,
We're
it is.
saying
and
in the
I-
short term, we're removing it, but we're removing it so that we can put these standards in place. And I don't think there's any way that ultimately, you know, because a future council will change that. I will guarantee it, because you have to make the old new. You know, you have to redesign as generations go and all the rest of it. And you know, and that's why you see, you know, New York City developed the way it is, or Chicago, or, you know, the resorts, Park City, you know. I mean, you know, they pay for the development by creating ways to add to it, you know, and what do? They, you know, like in some of the ski resorts, they go up a story, and that upper story pays for the redevelopment of the whole building, you know.
yes,
And that's just inevitable.
I don't want to say this, yes, but that's not what we're doing right now. And when we enacted the moratorium, we talked about, you know, mixed-use development and things like that. And I'm not questioning your sincerity in being willing to do that in 6 months, but I think that's what the public is wanting to know. And that's what I'm wanting to know is what are those intentions when we get 6 months out? Do we want to encourage or leave the door open for more development with these standards? And you've got to acknowledge you're not doing that right now. That's not what you're doing.
No, because we're not ready.
Although to some degree you are, because if somebody brings to you an application and they comply with these application requirements, you do have the ability to say yes or no at that point. I think, you know, on a personal level, you know, each of you may want to communicate to the public, you know, what your views are on what happens, you know, going forward. Again, for this issue of expectation. But that process, again, is in place already with this ordinance. And so just to touch on this issue of expectation, in as much as we're not drawing these larger polygons to set a false expectation of, you know, eligibility or approval, by not including them, you know, are you also sending the expectation that there is no more, not one more, anywhere, ever? And so I think, you know, I don't know that you want to hash all of that out today, because that's going to be a very long conversation, but I think that's what you do want to be thinking about prior to Tuesday in the way that you communicate, you know, the reason for your vote.
Can you go back to the updated whereases? We didn't get a copy of this one yet, did we?
An email.
By and large, they're all, you've seen this. There were, again, some.
I'm just thinking about, you know, capturing some of that stuff that Curtis was bringing up of, you know, appropriate planning and playing catch up and,
I think a lot of that is in there already.
I guess, is there a good whereas that highlights that there's this option through the overlay for,
new approvals?
Yeah.
Well, I think, again, that's up to you as a council to determine, not, you know.
I think we're overthinking this. I think
Yeah.
we just need to do it, and then get the standards in place, and then move on. You know, I mean, you know, we can tighten it up or loosen it up, but I think it's pretty darn good the way it is. And I'm ready to go with this, and then trust that we get the standards put in place.
And the recitals, the purpose of the recitals is to establish the basis for the ordinance. We don't want to repeat what's in the ordinance. The ordinance allows for that rezonability. And my other comment on that is even if someone comes to you before these standards are created, as part of the rezone application, your conditions, you can impose standards. It's appropriate.
And so, with that in mind, so we're talking about including properties in the overlay that don't have, yeah. And so what would is there a way to hold them to these standards that are still
We will
TBD?
discuss that in closed session,
Gotcha,
and then we may discuss it again in open session.
gotcha.
Well, just some of the whereases, there's some really amazing, just helpful information there that just from like a context standpoint about the total units that are coming online. One of the statistics that I hadn't yet heard is the amount of overnight accommodations that's higher than permanent housing. That's really interesting. As far as just the statistics in the whereases, I think it's a really good document to, the talking points in here for a lot of the issues. There's a lot of information here that really sets context for the pickle that we're in. We're a resort town, that's evolving, and we're a host of millions of people, and we're dealing with a lot of challenges subsequently.
Is there any other duking out that we need to do now while we're
Are we good?
time and comfortable?
We feel good that we're gonna be able to come across as fairly united on our decision on Tuesday night?
I'm not head nodding that I'm supportive of this. I still have a lot of problems, but that's my right to reserve my head nod.
Is there more discussion with all of us that you feel needs to happen?
I think some discussion in closed session, I've got some questions, and not necessarily that's going to send me one way or the other, but
I fully respect your reservations, and I would ask that they continue on Tuesday. If there's going to be a fireworks show, let's do it now.
No, I've
Okay.
already spoke my piece about my fireworks with this long before this meeting. And that's Mary's comment is that we ran out of time, and I think 6 months in hiring Landmark, we had the time to adopt these standards and these things. And my personal opinion is that we could have come a lot closer to providing that certainty around the corner. But we had that discussion. I'm not going to beat my head against the wall with that. And regardless, it is what it is. We're here today. So, my powder's going to stay mostly dry on Tuesday. How about that? Greg would have appreciated that as a black powder rifle.
All right. Is there any other burning desires? Was there a motion to move into closed session? Was that on our agenda as a possible? Yes,
There
closed
is
session if
possible.
necessary.
And I request it, so I would like a motion.
I move that we go into closed session.
I second.
For the purpose of?
Discussing pending litigation.
I move that we go into closed session to discuss pending litigation.
Motion made by Mary McGann,
Seconded
seconded by Terry Morris. All those in favor? Aye. Motion passes unanimously.
Which is 4, not 5.
Yes. Oh, yeah. For the record, Greg Halliday left at 2:03. All right.
And y'all out for a bit.
Yeah. Thank you.
Where's my lunch?
The guy for herself didn't like it.
I can see it's happy. I got some olives.
I got some pistachios.
I'd offer them for Curtis, but they might have pink eye on them, so they're all
Yeah, I'm
mine.
trying to cut down.
Yeah, I know. I saw him looking at me trying to see it in there.
Get out of here.
Just a heads up, those cookies are from
That's insane.
our task force meetings. Send off JD. So today will be the last day. Go say goodbye to him if you want to stop down to the office.
Sorry, say that again?
JD's gone.
Oh, the mapper guy?
Gotta say hi to him today.
Much more than a map.
Gotta say, see you later, yeah.
Where's he going?
Gotta get my mapping in.
How dare you?
Where's he going? What's he doing?
He's going to get a master's in planning at the University of Illinois. And at Champagnat